This week, I'll be throwing a batch of 3 porcelain bud vases. These are inherently simple objects at first glance. They're just a straight cylinder, but then the very top section of the wall is folded and thrown inward to create a very narrow opening that slopes inward. This helps to keep the flower or stem that's inserted into it to stand nice and straight. But first, I made my new rotor wheel ready to throw on, as the wheel tray was completely full after a day spent trimming. I then fetched my mirror, some warm throwing water, and gathered the tools I'll use for this process, which, if you've been watching my videos for long enough now, you'll be well acquainted with. But generally, I try to keep the number of tools I use when throwing to an absolute minimum, as in reality, my hands are going to be doing 90% of the work, so I just use what's essential. I'll be using some porcelain reclaim to make these. These are porcelain trimmings, like you saw at the start, which I've recycled back into usable porcelain. If you'd like to see how I do that, I'll include a link to a video about it on screen now and in the description below. This slab of reclaimed clay has been sat, wrapped up in plastic for a while now, so before it can be used, it needs to be given a really thorough spiral wedge. This is the process of folding and rotating the clay in such a way that it progressively pops any tiny air pockets there might be, along with making it one even texture throughout, which is essential when throwing on the potter's wheel, as any small inconsistencies, like a void of air or a firm patch of clay, can cause the entire pot to undulate or become distorted, and essentially it just makes the process of throwing more difficult than it need be. Yet, there are ways of dealing with those issues if they do arise, but it helps to eliminate them as best you can before you sit down at the wheel and throw. Once wedged up, this porcelain will be weighed out into individual lumps of clay, and for these vases, I'll be using about 730 grams per piece, which is approximately 1 pound and 10 ounces. As it's quite difficult to tear away the perfect amount, I often end up tearing away some smaller lumps to add to the larger piece, which does mean that this weighed out mass will need another quick wedge just to bring those pieces together, but that only takes a minute or so. It's still spiral wedging, just on a much smaller scale, and it's only done until I feel like all those separate pieces of clay are truly melded into one. I then give the table a quick wipe. I'm a clean as you go sort of person, as opposed to doing one big cleanup at the end of the day. I make sure the shape I'll be throwing against the wheel has a rounded bottom. That way it won't trap any air beneath it when it's slammed firmly onto the wheel. Hydration is critical, so I douse the lump of porcelain in some slippy water. Slip means it's slightly saturated with clay, and then I centre it and begin the process of coning the clay up and down. If you think of clay like a bag of rice, all the particles it's made up of, which are called platelets, are all facing in different directions, and as you cone it up and down, this causes all of those particles to align and face the same direction, which in part should make the clay more plastic and a bit more attentive and easier to throw. And you can feel it. With each additional cone up and down, I feel like the clay is smoother, like it's even more centered, and I can move it about without any irregularities creeping up. Finally, once coned and fully centered, I plunge my index finger and thumb into the center of the lump, before opening out horizontally to form the base. I haven't pushed all the way down to the wheel head though, instead I've left it about 4 to 5 millimeters thick. I'll then thoroughly compress the bottom, running my fingers and thumb over it, and even slightly compressing it down with a rubber kidney. This is all done in order to prevent the base from cracking as it dries. This can be quite a common occurrence, especially with porcelain, a fault potters call S-cracks, because, as the name describes, the crack usually occurs sort of in the shape of an S. Once I've finished the base, I'll then wet my fingers and the wall of clay before squeezing right close to the bottom and lift the clay gradually up. I don't aim to achieve all the height in the first pull, rather this initial movement is just to thin out what is quite a thick expanse of clay, and it's in the second and third pulls where I really focus on achieving height. On the inside, my fingers are very slightly pushing out where you can see that bulge that travels up the outside of the wall. On the outside, I'm lifting this bulge of porcelain up, In this instance, with a soaked sponge, as it helps to keep the wall wet as I'm working, but you can equally too use your knuckle and your fingertips to perform this exact task, and I often do. Once both hands are working in unison, I move them up as one in a very even and gradual motion. And you'll know when you're doing it right, as the walls will grow taller and the throwing rings left in the surface are completely even from bottom to top. And once the rim is reached, I don't pull through it, instead I just very gently release both hands. After each pull, the cylinder is collared, which corrects the shape and just helps keep everything a bit more under control. And for this third pull, instead of using a sponge on the outside, I'm using the tip of my index finger to harshly push in near the base to drag up the last reserves of clay in the base of the walls. As ideally, I want the walls from top to bottom to be entirely even in cross section. Although with this particular shape, I intentionally leave the top 4 to 5 centimeters relatively thick, as for reasons that'll become quite apparent. Once the height is approximately there, I'll sponge out all the excess water and then roughly clean up 90% of the outside form. This begins by scraping away the skirt of clay from around the base, and then I proceed to scrape off much of the slip from the outer walls, save for a small portion just around the top, which will be the area I collar in to form the inward sloping rim. As excess clay builds up along the tool's edge, I'll take it off and remove it, as otherwise it can become quite clogged and it won't leave you with a smooth, even surface. And with the outside done and the top section prepared, I can move on to folding over the top, which I do with wet hands that are placed all the way around the cylinder. I then squeeze the top in to create a more narrow opening. I then just go back to pull this corner upward to make a more defined right angle. Then, with one finger kept underneath the wall for support, I'll throw this top portion of the wall inward, which thins it out. And this is why, in combination with the right angle, I left a bit of thickness in the top portion of the wall. As if I'd thrown it to be wafer thin initially, and then tried to do this, there's a good chance I'd run into a problem, and this whole overhanging section could collapse and slump in completely. Normally, after completing this part, the lower portions of the pot will be covered in a thin film of water, so I quickly scrape that away before further defining the top. I gingerly position a finger inside, and with the metal kidney I very gently push down. And you'll notice, when doing this, that this causes the outside portion of the wall to bulge out, which I'll then correct by pushing it back in, and as I do this you can see just how much the opening inside drops. Once I've done this, I try not to touch the overhanging section anymore, as it's so easy for that part to slump in more than I'd like, which means it's easier in many ways to just leave it, even if it is a tiny bit messy, as it'll be much easier to refine once it's leather hard, as you'll run no risk of it slumping in anymore. And I'll just show this procedure once again from another angle. I use the flat edge of the kidney to gradually ease the top inward, and from the outside where the bulge has now appeared, I carefully push it straight. After that's done, the bud vase is more or less finished. To remove it from the wheel, I slide a twisted metal wire underneath it. Then, with dry hands, I carefully clasp them all the way around the vase, lift, and set the pot aside with the others. That's all there is to them at this stage. They're inherently simple objects, and once trimmed they'll look even more defined, with straighter sides and a sharper lip around the top. And you can see how the restricted opening keeps whatever's placed inside it completely upright. And these make up more porcelain vases to my growing collection, which as time goes by, I'm leaning closer and closer to just coating them all with a very simple white glaze, or even just leaving the outsides matte. I'm not really sure yet. Let me know what you think. And, like always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.